Economist at TIPS, where I lead our work around sustainability and just transition. And it's really a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of TIPS. For those who do not know TIPS, it stands for Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies. We're an economic policy research institute based in Pretoria, doing work on economic policy in pursuit of social progress and inclusive development and environmental sustainability. So what is a just transition project? Does this count as a just transition investment? That is the seemingly simple yet very complicated question that we are going to investigate today. Welcome everyone to this TIPS development dialogue and webinar. My name is Gaylor Montmasson-Clair. I'm a senior economist at TIPS, where I lead our work around sustainability and just transition. And it's really a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of TIPS. For those who do not know TIPS, it stands for Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies. We're an economic policy research institute based in Pretoria, doing work on economic policy in pursuit of social progress and inclusive development and environmental sustainability. So what is a just transition project? It really triggers a lot of practical issues that would arise as South Africa embarks on just transition and as funding from domestic as well as international sources gets unlocked and allocated to projects, programs, policies. It triggers the need for a framework to provide direction and guidance on what would count as a just transition project or investment, but also give clarity on eligibility and measurement criteria. We took, as a global community, decades to develop a framework for green or climate finance. We certainly cannot wait that long to have such a framework for just transition. Thankfully, and certainly, I think we're only going to get this right as a country if we take all different inputs and perspectives, both domestic and international, to develop a framework that is fit for purpose and meets our realities and our needs. Following an overview of the framework, other speakers will bring a set of different perspectives based on real-world projects or processes, and I'm sure they will bring very insightful questions and insights on the framework, as well as the issues that it aims to address. I've no doubt that we'll have a very rich discussion, and I really would encourage everyone to take part in the chat, but also in the Q&A when we get there. To take us forward and moderate today's proceeding, it's really my pleasure to introduce and welcome Shamila Subramani, who I'm sure is no stranger to most of you. She is the CEO of the National Business Initiative, NBI, and has been in the space for a very long time, notably spearheading the effort of the JSE as the Chief Sustainability Officer. She's also a non-executive director of WWF South Africa and has been really an expert on the issues of finance, climate change, and just transition, spearheading many of the efforts in the country. Shamila, thank you again for your time and for accepting our invitation to moderate today's session. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Gaylor, and it's a privilege to be here. I'm apologizing in advance for my little voice today, recovering from quite a heavy flu. But as long as everyone can hear me, we're good to go. So thanks everybody who's made time. It's great to see the numbers of people joining in the conversation today. I have absolutely no doubt it's going to be fascinating and stimulating, but most importantly, a very critical conversation for where we need to go in relation to being able to firstly enable a just transition, and secondly, being able to finance it. And how do we bring these two things together in a manner that can achieve that element of the just element of the transition in particular. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we continue. The first thing is that please feel free throughout the chat to start posting your questions. I'm going to encourage you to really think about different angles as you hear our speakers going through the course today, and telling us what you think, posting those questions into the chat. And also later on, there will be a question and answer session where you'll be free to raise your hand to ask a question. So please hold off any raising of hands to the time while we get to the speakers, and then keep that for later on in the session. And of course, you're free during the session to start posting questions, which we will then take and try to collate and get through. And we have time for the question and answer session after our speakers have gone through. So the running order of today is that first we're going to have a presentation by Sandy Lode of TIPS, and then after that, three esteemed guests joining us. Is going to be Neil Cole from the Project Management Unit in the Presidency, looking after the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, and David from the AFD, and then Hermine Boertes from Anglo American. So let me start off with no further ado by introducing Sandy. Sandy, of course, from TIPS, and who again might be no stranger to some of you. And very esteemed. So Sandy holds an MCom from Wits University in Economics. She's helped establish that economics department in the Gauteng provincial government in 1995, where she was until 2006. So Sandy, if there's anything wrong with Gauteng provincial government's economic plan, we know who to come to. And of course, has been involved in a number of different things, including working at Blue IQ when they delivered the large infrastructure projects such as the Gautrain, the Innovation Hub, and the Automotive Supplier Park. Sandy's been very active in public policy research and strategy development. She's worked for the Presidency, the DTIC, and Treasury, amongst others. Very active recently in Just Transition Finance research, and in 2021 drafted the Just Transition Finance Roadmap. Sandy, absolute pleasure to introduce you, and I hand over to you to take us through the content of the research report that is a matter of discussion for today. Thank you.
Thanks, Shamila, and I'd like to just add my welcome to everybody and thank you for joining us here today. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the Just Transition Transaction Framework, but before I begin, I'd just like to say that even though this is a TIPS document, I'd like to acknowledge that it is in fact a collaborative product that came out of an amazing working group of academics and practitioners in the field of project development, finance, and disclosure. And we're incredibly grateful to the guidance and the input and the creativity of that working group. I'm assuming you can see my slideshow. Okay, so the framework is being launched in response to a measurable shift we're seeing in the discourse in relation to just transition financing. For the last 4 or 5 years, the debate really and truly has been about capital mobilization and unlocking capital. And very much more recently, there has been this palpable shift to capital allocation and capital deployment issues. So for the last 4, 5, 6 years, it's been about how do we mobilize capital to support a just transition. And the major debate points have been what is the relative role of the global north relative to developing countries? What is the role of the state relative to the private sector? And it's been realized in concrete commitments such as the Paris Agreement and the JETP. Then more recently, in probably the last 12 months, the discourse has moved to how do we actually unlock those capital mobilization commitments? And we're seeing that across the board with investments by DFIs, bilateral political negotiations, and very currently the unpacking of the IPG offer, which Neil will be able to tell us about later. And certainly, I would say this calendar year, in the last 6 months, the debate has moved towards, if this money becomes unlocked, how do we actually answer the question of how do we allocate it and how do we deploy it on the ground? So what this framework has been designed to do is to try and answer the question of how can we help users to navigate what is a context-specific South African just transition transaction. What is that going to look like? And I stress the word specific South African transaction because, as Gaylor mentioned, the Impact Investing Institute in the UK has come up with what works as a global north framework. And when looking at it in the South African context, we felt that it wasn't entirely fit for purpose, although a huge contribution to the debate. So this framework has to do a lot of very, very heavy lifting, and it's doing heavy lifting in two main areas. The first one is it's got to provide guidance and direction on what could constitute a just transition transaction in a developing country context. And there are three really big, scary questions that need to be answered under that. The first one is, what is going to be good enough to count as a just transition investment? The second one is going to be, what do we need to measure to confirm that a project is actually delivering a just outcome and impact? And thirdly, how are we going to compare and contrast investments? So if there is a pot of just transition money and we have competing investments, how would we decide that we prefer one investment over another? On a slightly different tack, the second thing the framework needs to do is it needs to help us on the journey that we're taking in terms of getting clarity on what counts as a just transition investment. And so it needs to provide a methodology which has to support iterative and evidence-based learning by doing, because we don't know what counts as a just transition, so we have to learn by doing. But at the same time, while we're learning, we need to facilitate investment flows on the ground so that we're actually seeing delivery of just transition initiatives on the ground. And all the time, we need to be building consensus and uptake of the framework in what is a very, very complex area. So once again, the framework needs to answer three questions. It needs to marry top-down theoretical research with bottom-up project-level experience and information. It needs to create informational feedback loops that allow us to develop different iterations that admit the complexity of what we're doing, but still bring people along with us. And we need to provide a process where we start improving our understanding of definitions and parameters and measurements. And I think the point that Gaylor also alluded to is this is going to be a long-term journey. This is not a short project. The framework is based on some building blocks, and we could spend days discussing these, but I'm going to go over them very, very briefly. The first one is that we want a framework which is going to be applicable in a very broad array of environments. So it needs to work across all sectors, so mining, manufacturing, financial services sectors, all sectors. It needs to work across all financing scales and activities. So it's got to answer questions for project finance, but also for portfolio finance. If you had a just transition fund of funds, it would need to work there. It would need to work for different investment vehicles and different instruments across asset classes. So it needs to be highly, highly versatile because you don't want lots of competing frameworks. And then it also needs to work across a range of geographies. So nationally, sub-nationally, across all 9 provinces, and at a very locational specific level, almost at a community level if necessary. The second thing, and this was also a huge area of debate for the working group, is should the framework be based on existing frameworks and standards, or do we add to existing measurement frameworks and standards? So the UK model is based on existing ESG disclosures. we very much felt that the South African baseline of inequality and our historic experience with colonialism and apartheid meant that we're going to need just transition outcomes and impacts in excess of ESG. So we're saying that we're using the ESG as a base, but then we are expanding it. And even though we know there needs to be alignment with Global North measurement and disclosure, the feeling in the working group was that there is space for context specificity as long as we're rigorous about it and transparent about it and explain why we need it and how we're going to use it. The third building block is this idea that we're going to get better at understanding the just transition over time. And we're also probably going to become more ambitious in terms of what we can wring out of just transition projects over time. So we've given the framework legs to grow over time. So just to give you one example, I think people forget in 1998 when we had the Rio Earth Summit and for the first time we had the green agenda starting to take shape. We had no idea in those days how to measure mitigation and adaptation. And they started with a very, very low bar. They said, we don't know how to measure it yet, so start by just telling me what impacts you're trying to have. And then after years of developing ideas and frameworks, they said, okay, let's progress from telling to showing. And eventually we've got to the modern era where people can prove what they are achieving. And I think we're going to have a similar journey when it comes to monitoring and evaluation of just transition. Then in terms of just transition ambition, we believe that projects can and will become more ambitious, and we believe it's important that the framework incentivizes this increase in ambition. And then very lastly, quickly, we're building this framework on the basis that we haven't got perfect knowledge in the short run, but we need to make sure that funds are going to flow. So we need to learn by doing. And by doing that, there are going to be gaps and there are going to be limitations in the framework, and we understand and accept that up front. So the methodology we've put together is a really, really basic learning framework. So step one is we put together a draft framework, which is the document that we're launching today. After that, we go out and start collecting information on projects, and then we feed that project information into the framework, and we see whether the framework is good or not. So let's assume that the framework ends up excluding 100% of the projects that we've collected information for. That tells us that our bar is probably too high. If we include 100% of the projects, the bar is probably too low. And if we can't assess the projects, then the parameters of the framework need to be reconsidered. So on the basis of using that project information to test the framework, we'd then amend the framework, and then we do that exercise every 2 or 3 years. So keep on getting the information and fine-tuning the framework according to real-world information and our understanding of that information. So the very big picture of the framework is that at its most simple level, we're saying that a just transition is made up of 3 core elements. Doesn't matter the exact wording. We know we need to work on the wording. But the first core element is that there must be community voice and community engagement and participation. So that's step number 1. Secondly, there needs to be climate action and environmental activity for it to be a just transition project. And thirdly, it needs to involve some element of socioeconomic improvement and decreased inequality. And those 3 come from the G7 Just Transition Blueprint, and we've used them as general high-level ideas and then fine-tuned them for the South African context. The way the framework works is pretty simple. There are 3 big steps. The first one is pre-screening. If you don't meet pre-screening, you don't get to carry on in the process. If you do meet pre-screening, you go to evaluation. And in evaluation, we evaluate you in terms of climate action and the environment and socioeconomic improvement. And based on the pre-screening and the evaluation, you then get a designation. And there are three possible outcomes of a project going through the framework. The first one is that you fail to meet the requirements and you don't count as a just transition investment or transaction. The second one is that you do meet the requirements and you are tagged or called a just transition investment. And the third option is that you are called a just transition plus investment. And the difference between 2 and 3 is your level of ambition, which we'll talk more about in a minute. So let's just go through the steps in a little bit of detail. The pre-screening, absolutely obvious. There's a set of excluded activities, so no new fossil fuel investments, no investments in armaments, tobacco, or the sex industries. There needs to be compliance with the South African Constitution and all laws and regulation. Number 3 is more interesting. In the UK model, community voice and participation and engagement is optional. In South Africa, we've escalated it and made it non-negotiable, which is why it's in the pre-screening category. And we're basically saying, we don't just need you to say you're going to do community engagement. We need you to show us your strategy. You need to have an implementation plan for that strategy. And we need to know that there is budget to make that strategy come to fruition. In other words, we don't just want a tick box exercise where you have a workshop and it's over. And then the fourth pre-screening element is that a project needs to have internal approval within the champion of the project, and there needs to be some funding committed to it. And the purpose of that is we don't want projects which are just somebody's idea but haven't had any flesh put onto the bones. So we need to know that the project's been properly thought through, that there is internal support for it, that there is some money for it, even though additional funding may be necessary. And there needs to be some funding committed, but it doesn't necessarily need to have been dispersed at this point. And you need to meet all 4 pre-screening requirements in order to proceed to evaluation. Now, the evaluation looks more complicated than it is. Basically, from the Just Transition Finance Roadmap, we have a sample of Just Transition projects that have self-identified them as Just Transition projects. And basically, we found that they fell into 2 big camps. There were projects that were fundamentally and in principle green projects, which had socioeconomic elements. And then there were projects that the fundamental purpose of them was a socioeconomic outcome, but they did have some green elements to them. And we wanted to include both of those projects. So we have a dual gate system where a project can either enter through a green gate, so top left, number 1 there, or bottom left, enter through a socioeconomic gate. So let's just go through a green project entry. The project has passed the pre-screening, so it comes into the evaluation, and the first question we ask is, does the project qualify as a green project? If the answer is no, we exclude the project. If the project's yes, it goes to the next evaluation question, which is, does it also seek to improve socioeconomic outcomes? If the answer is no, then we exclude the project. If the answer is yes, then it goes down to the first green box and it is classified as a Just Transition project. So the big question then is, how do we start thinking about what qualifies as green and what qualifies as improving socioeconomic outcomes? And that is where the bulk of the effort in the framework has been focused. So the green evaluation is obviously much easier because we've drawn on the green finance taxonomy. So what we say is that a project that comes in the green gate needs to identify one of 6 objectives, and that objective could be climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, sustainable use of water and marine resources, pollution prevention, sustainable resource use and circularity, or economic system protection and restoration. Under each of those objectives, there is a detailed list of qualifying activities. The project will also need to identify what are the most relevant qualifying activities. And the framework provides a list of all the activities that we can consider at the moment. We'll obviously work on that list over time. We not only have qualifying activities, but we also have indicators at the objective level. We don't have indicators at the activity level, but we do have them at the objective level. Now, what we're seeking to do with these objectives and activities is to provide project champions and financiers with direction of what type of activity is going to count as green just transition activity, and give them direction without being overly prescriptive. So, as I say, not highly controversial, although, as we know, there are people who disagree with the green finance taxonomy, specifically in relation to nuclear and gas. Far more difficult was to come up with how are we going to evaluate socioeconomic improvement. And here there wasn't anything to fall back on. We've had to create brand new material. The process is the same. A project has to say, what is the relative socioeconomic improvement objective that we are seeking to achieve? And we have come up with 4 possible objectives: supporting employment and livelihood opportunities, improving access to services, supporting the strengthening and development of existing and new supply chains, and improving community spaces, organizations, and services. Once again, what we've done is under each objective, we have come up with a list of activities. And these are the creation of tips and the working group. And they are obviously part of what will be a very, very long ongoing future agenda of work. We put the activity lists together, specifically trying to find activities that were most relevant to just transitioning, as opposed to, for example, using all the SDGs or all the goals of the NDP. But going forward, we're going to have to test the scope and the breadth of those activities. There's a lot of work to be done on their articulation and how we define them. And there are lots of gaps and limitations. And once again, it's a voyage, and this is a first step. So we have a list of qualifying activities, and we have put together a list of objective level indicators as well. And those are all in the annexures of the framework. Once again, all we're trying to do is not be overly prescriptive, but to provide direction and guidance. So you now understand how a project could be evaluated in terms of whether it's green or not, and then whether it meets socioeconomic outcomes or not. And that would take you to that green box on the left, which is if you have yes to both of those, you are a just transition project. I want to now focus on those 2 green boxes and explain briefly this idea of 2 designations and the idea of embracing different levels of ambition for a just transition. So what we've said is that we want these designations so that we can incentivize higher levels of ambition. So you start off as a just transition project, and then it is possible that you can advance to being a just transition plus project. And the way you do that is by delivering meaningful empowerment to a previously disadvantaged group. So we needed a bunch of qualifying activities that would count as meaningful empowerment. And we've come up with 3. The first is you can meaningfully empower a group of people through ownership of productive assets or intellectual property or shareholdings in an entity. You could also do it by representation in management of an entity. And then we've also put in the fact that communities themselves during the engagement process may come up with participation mechanisms that we haven't thought of, and new business models may come up with new participation that we hadn't thought of, and that we need to include these. And the idea very much is that we will incentivize project developers to advance from a just transition to a just transition plus status by offering preferential access to funding, increased concessionality, and increased credit enhancements for just transition plus projects. I'm nearly wrapped up now. Our second last slide basically deals with the big elephant in the room, which is how do we deal with the disclosure and the measurement issue? So the point of departure is that nobody knows how to measure if a just transition is being achieved or not, because nobody's delivered a just transition. We need to answer that question while we make sure funds are already flowing. So there are three key theoretical issues. The first one is that if we want indicators to be meaningful and useful, they've got to be material to a project or an investment, and they need to be context specific. However, that fundamentally undermines standardization and benchmarking and comparability, which is what the financial sector need in order to allocate capital. So you almost have an existential tension between those 2 points. And part of what the community is going to have to sort out in the next coming years is how we deal with that tension. What we've tried to do in the framework to deal with it is we've got some standardized indicators, and the purpose of having the standardized indicators is to assist with adoption so that this doesn't look like a totally foreign animal to existing financiers. And it will assist with interoperability in terms of attracting offshore money. So we have used some standard indicators, but what we've also done is we've augmented them by saying that project champions can also come up with bespoke indicators. And those bespoke indicators will assist with materiality and context specificity. And the IFC have done this very, very effectively in their sustainability-linked loans. And our speaker from Anglo American was involved in the negotiations for one of those bespoke indicators. So hopefully she'll be able to tell us more about that. And then finally, in closing, in terms of next steps, the framework and its methodology is totally dependent on accessing good quality project data against which we can test and improve the framework. So the next step is that a data gathering template is being finalized, and we're beta testing it at the moment. The template will very soon, hopefully in the next 2 weeks, be published and socialized and distributed. Thereafter, we'll collect data and analyze it. Using that analyzed data, we will revise the framework, and then we will publish the framework, and we hope to have the first iteration framework published before the end of the year. Thank you very much, and sorry for running slightly over.
Thank you very much. I think that was fascinating, and judging from the chat as well, a huge amount of interest. Can I just check if we're okay to take a few questions for Sandy now, or would the organizers prefer for me to hold them over until the end? Nandwe, maybe you could guide us.
I think we can hold them off till the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, that's fine. And thank you for everybody. Keep those questions coming in. It's really, really exciting ones that we're seeing coming through. So Sandy, I think a really useful and helpful overview onto what is being proposed as the framework, and a lot to think about in relation to the need to not be completely going with what a global north view is, and for us to be able to start anchoring what a just transition means in the context of our operating context. But of course, equally, I think there's a high level of applicability for other small, medium-sized countries as well, as we do see in the framework document. So thank you for sharing that. I think that is exceptionally useful. Now, of course, is the question of where the rubber hits the road, right? And so our next set of speakers aim to give their views a little bit. So we have 3 speakers coming up who have outlined earlier on. And Neil Cole is going to go first. So Neil, it's my pleasure to introduce you. Thank you very much for joining us today. I think you have the really unenviable task of sitting in the JETP project management unit now, starting to have to make decisions about what projects access the sort of financing we're getting and which ones don't, the long or the short of it. But that is no easy task. And I'm hoping that what we'll see coming through is how a framework like this is potentially useful to you. But also if you can just share to us the challenges of sitting within that unit. So just to introduce Neil to our audience on the call today, he's got over 20 years, more than 20 years professional experience in the field of public finance and international financial relations. He's got an absolutely enviable biography, which I won't go through in detail right now, except to say that he's worked intensively within Treasury, a number of senior management positions, budget office, international economic policy divisions, and of course has represented us globally as well on a number of different fora that are directly relevant, I think, to what he's doing in the Secretariat. He currently teaches a course in public finance for social protection at the International Training Center of the ILO. So there's direct insight, I think, into some of what the ILO does, which, as we know, has also been instrumental in contributing to some of these indicators globally. And Neil joined the JETP Secretariat in July 2022, and his undergraduate and postgraduate qualifications cover public administration, policy, and politics. Neil, it's our pleasure to have you with us today, and I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shamila, and thank you to Sandy for this excellent presentation. Maybe just to start with 2 reactions. I mean, the first is that I'm really glad that it is referred to as the first iteration, because by iteration it is implied that there's a fair degree of experimentation that is allowed, and an opportunity to learn from both successes and mistakes that we are likely to make along the way and have made already. And then secondly, to say that this is going to be a really complex process going forward. I think there are going to be many unknowns in terms of not everyone agreeing on what the challenge is that we need to tackle, and certainly lots of disagreement around what the possible solutions are going to and can be. I also think that the framework as it is set out at the moment is going to provide valuable input to the work that many of us are undertaking. And this morning we were part of a discussion on impact investing, and I can already see how this framework is going to provide really valuable inputs to that exercise. On the JET IP, and I always want to remind people that it's a 5-year plan, and as with all good 5-year plans, it needs to have a set of priorities. It's not going to be able to do everything. It needs to be well costed, and costed over a period where there's a degree of medium-term expenditure that is applied in terms of what you're going to be requiring in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, and year 5. And then also a plan that has to identify the responsibilities and also what the legal framework is in which the plan is being implemented. The plan has a large finance requirement. It's 1.5 trillion. When I was in the Treasury, or the last year that I was in the Treasury, the 3-year budget was touching on 1 trillion. I think the budget at the moment is slightly over, for the entire budget, is slightly over 1 trillion per annum. So it is a large need finance need that's been identified. And I think a good way to think about it is not necessarily in terms of private, public, and blended, but to think of it in terms of the various instruments, because that allows for a deeper dive into, what unlocks these various instruments, what are the likely hurdles that need to be overcome, who do you need to engage with, whose responsibility is it to unlock, etc. So it's good to think of it as, those concessional loans that we have and that we're going to have to mobilize a lot more of, the grants that we have within the 8.5 billion package, and how much more we need to mobilize, and then there's the commercial financing, and in this case, the private sector is going to play a very significant role, especially in generation, but possibly also in transmission. Having a public finance background, I like to, start thinking about the financing of a plan from a fiscal space perspective, where you say that this is a plan of South Africa, and it is a plan that we now need to consider in terms of how we are going to finance that plan. And if one takes a fiscal space analysis, you can finance your plan either from domestic revenues, so the taxes that you're collecting. You can decide that you're going to allocate towards a new priority from an improvement in economic growth and an improvement in tax collection. But you can also, finance your plans through increased borrowing. You can finance your plans from procuring what is traditionally public goods differently, so through a partnership with the private sector, or you can turn to your development partners and see what the opportunities are for increased grants that are allocated. So if we were to think of the concessional loans within the package, at the time when we were drafting the JET investment plan, much of the financing or concessional loans were going to be loans that would direct loans to Eskom, and in particular the accelerated coal transition in investment plan, which is the next 3 coal power stations that are due for repurposing and repowering, and then also an allocation towards Transnet. The Eskom debt relief measures does put somewhat of a spanner in the works, in that all new borrowing to Eskom has been stopped by the debt relief measures. It allows us, and it impacts on both the repurposing and repowering, as well as the investments that are required to be made by the new transmission company into the expansion of the transmission grid, and also, in some way or the other, will have an impact on the type of investments that are required in distribution. We're looking at innovative and alternate ways in which we can still get to the concessional loans to Eskom projects, and I think it opens up an exciting opportunity to be creative in looking at off-balance sheet mechanisms, where we're able to also then use the concessional loans and the grants in a catalytic way to crowd in private investors into the repurposing and the repowering, but also in terms of the transmission and distribution grids. I mean, maybe now that I've mentioned repurposing and repowering, and in reference to the lessons that we need to learn, I think Kumati does throw up a very important lesson in the way that we want to proceed. I suppose the one criticism is that we thought of Kumati as a sort of in a very linear approach, decommissioning, repowering, the repurposing, and repowering. Whereas clearly the lesson from Kumati is that we need to think of it as a bespoke plan for a power station and all future power stations to be repurposed and repowered, and to see where possibly repowering, where just transition projects, where repurposing can start up a lot earlier, so that when we do speak about taking care of coal power station workers, coal mine workers, and address the issues of communities in the immediate vicinity, the plan can then be developed in a way where you're not thinking of this as a linear approach, but where you're thinking of how do you front load a lot of the just transition projects a lot earlier. And that's where grants are going to have to play a very important role. And everybody's been speaking about grants and support to TA, not just being used on studies upon studies, but that grants should be used increasingly for projects, and in particular the just transition projects, and also grants that can increasingly draw in and improve the quality of some of the other financing instruments. We think of grants as an opportunity to put in place mechanisms, and Sandy touched on this, putting in place mechanisms where there can be a process where we match the financing with the project. That is important, but I think that even more important is the projects that are going to be receiving the funds, to look at the support that is provided to those projects. I think there's a lesson from our land reform program, that we were able to settle the land claims. We had associations that we put in place. There were elected leaders, but the kind of care that was required in terms of training, in terms of post-settlement support that was required, the type of structures that were put in place, the financial management training that may have been required, those things are all really, really important to think about in terms of the sustainability of the projects. And then, maybe in wrapping up, just to touch on some thoughts on private investors. This is sometimes thought of as the least complicated, in that if the conducive environment is created, that the private sector will come in and invest. And I think the REAP is an example of this. But I think there are issues around transformation, and whether the private sector has a proven track record in transformation. So we need to be looking at if the private sector is likely to finance 70% of our 1.5 trillion 5-year plan, and beyond that, how do we build into those finance packages social ownership, so that we ensure that we do in a meaningful way see the energy transition as a transformative program, not only in the first 5 years, but also over the next 27 years as we move towards net zero emissions. So just in summary, I mean, it's a massive bill. It's 1.5 trillion. It's a very significant amount to mobilize. We've identified the 8.5 offer. There are some new partners that have joined the IPG and some non-IPG partners. So we're clearly seeing an increase in the funds that we need to mobilize. Secondly, there is very significant unlocking that needs to happen, both in terms of the disbursement channels, making sure that the financing is fit for purpose, and what is also going to have a very significant impact is the state of the fiscus, right? Our public finances are not looking all that rosy, just based on very recent comments that have been made. And then finally, we need to be developing, and the framework is going to help with this. We need to be developing a project pipeline, not only in terms of infrastructure investment, but also in terms of economic diversification, social ownership projects, projects in the value chain, etc. So let me stop there. Thank you very much, and I hope I was able to stay within my time. Thank you.
You did well, Neil. But judging from the questions in the chat, we might have to take a lot more time from you in the question and answer. But thank you very much for that, Neil. I think also just setting out for us a good context in terms of some of the realities of the challenges that we're facing, and in a very calm way explaining how that relates to some of this. And I have shared with you some of the questions. You probably can see them in the chat, so prepare yourself. I'd now like to hand over to our next speaker, who is Under David, from the French Development Bank. And lovely to have you here today. And I hope that you're going to be able to give us a different perspective, sadly, from a development agency, which is AFD. So Anna is a senior researcher at the AFD and the lead economist on inequality. So she holds a PhD from the Parisian Dauphine. Please excuse my French accent, or lack thereof entirely, specializing in development economics with a focus on migration and labor markets. And she's currently focused on inequality and sustainability. So Dauphine, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here today. And since 2021, you're based at the Regional Bureau for Southern Africa in Joburg. So great to know that you've got some boots on the ground and hopefully seeing some of our reality and able to translate that into what that means from a perspective of a development agency in particular. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It seems that I have some significant challenges with internet all of a sudden. So can you just confirm that you can hear me and are seeing my screen?
Yes, Anda, we can. We can see the screen, okay, and we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, I will stop the camera though, because I still see Neil's camera stopping. Thank you so much, Amila, and a big thank you to Sandy and the TIPS colleagues for the invitation, and also for this very useful and timely piece of work. On my side, what I would like is just to share a couple of insights on what it means for a public development bank, such as IFD, to try to identify and support projects that focus specifically on the just dimension of the transition. And I actually think that this can be summarized as navigating between three key elements, which are what is counted as just transition or as just energy transition, by whom, and also how does this articulate with what is needed or considered as being top priorities. So on this first dimension, on what is counted, of course, the difference between JTs, the just transition, and the just energy transition is there, it's important. But as I think we all know, the just energy transition is included in the just transition. So then the main issue would come down to the alignment between the labeling and especially on this J, between the two concepts. And for instance, I think we could all agree that strengthening and increasing the coherence of social protection measures is key to the just transition. But then is this also the case for the just energy transition? And I think the PME is doing some work on that. I think, yeah, it would be worth for us to think around this and to see, especially for the holistic measures, what is relevant and how to align the two. Now, beyond this difference, usually when we set labels on our criteria for either JT or JET, this also means setting an ambition and differentiating between short-term and long-term objectives and agreeing on a long-term trajectory. And this is quite important for public development banks because their role and our role is supporting these long-term trajectories and thus complementing the government's work, which is often led by short and medium-term emergencies and priorities. Now, on the second point that we see as crucial when we think about what is counted is that these criteria should be based on principles or on broad objectives and not necessarily indicators. And one of the reasons, and Sandy also mentioned it in her presentation, is that different donors have different M&E indicators, and that having a tagging system that is based on principles allows one to avoid the complexity of monitoring these different transactions. But also, and again, as it was highlighted by Sandy, a parallel can then be drawn with climate finance and green finance, which is also defined according to principles. And the mechanism is now quite well established. Now, if we move to the whom, of course, for us, it's important, and as Neil also said, it's important to know who is measuring it, who is counting these projects as JET or non-JET or JT, because we fall under the issue of the commitments that were made. And I think all of the donors are keen to meet these commitments. So we also need to make sure that the transactions are commonly recognized and that we can align our operations in order to fall within this, the framework and the tagging system. It's also interesting to look at internally who counts it. And as IFD, for instance, we do not have a just transition framework for now. We have a concept note, for instance, on what could be the scope of just transition projects. And what we see also is that the realities are quite different across countries, but we haven't went too deep into the criteria. What we do have is an internal tool that helps us guide the approval of projects, which is aligned, which is called the Sustainable Development Scoreboard, that has been enhanced recently in order to include specifically inequality and biodiversity. Climate was already there, but the inequality dimension, the biodiversity dimensions, and also related to one of the points from TIPS framework, it also looks at whether communities or unions have been consulted and what was the degree of consultation and of agreement. On what is actually important, and one of the questions is when we think around the just dimension is justice for whom? And this is where our work becomes quite complicated and complex because, and this is where we need guidance. If you think of whom, so one of the first target populations could be the plant workers of coal plants, for instance, but these normally fall under ESCOM's responsibility. If we move further, then the sort of next population that would be impacted would be the coal mine workers. Now, who is responsible for these? Given the different issues around contractors, etc., it becomes very complex. Now, if we move even further around the core value chain workers, we also see that it's quite difficult to identify them, and again, to identify the responsibilities. And then if we reach to the community level, we do talk a lot about community consultations, community impacts, community projects. But who gets to decide what is the definition of the community, who is in the community or is not? And this is still a bit difficult to grasp. And then my last point would be on the just versus the social. And I think that there are sort of two dangers for donors such as us, is of course to fall into the sort of just washing, where any social project could be considered as a just transition project. But at the same time, if we only focus on specific policy or specific interventions around the just transition, we might leave out the systemic challenges around social policies. And if we take an example of the health clinics or the schools that are being partly or entirely funded by the mining companies that will be probably closing down, we get again to the question of who is responsible to continue the service delivery in terms of social services, for instance. How can a donor such as us, for instance, could support that? What is the scope of it? And also, how can it complement what the government can come in to do? So I just wanted to give you this sort of very brief overview of the challenges. In terms of specific projects, and I think this is across the board, when a public development bank identifies the projects, we often need to identify projects that are led by public partners, be it the government, public, state-owned enterprises, municipalities, etc. Now, again, we fall under who is responsible for each of the social aspects. So this is where the type of framework that's being developed by TIPS is quite important, because it allows us a little bit to identify whom can we work with at which level, and what are the specific policy or intervention actions that fall under the social. We would still need to think around the policy aspect, of course, and the coherence of it. But I think for us, it's quite an important step, because it helps us also internally navigate and align our procedures to the local demands. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think quite insightful, the inside track on how a development bank considers this, and of course some of the challenges with being able to do that. In the interest of time, I want to quickly move along to our next speaker and welcome her, who is none other than Hermine Boertes, who is from Anglo American. And of course, the perspective that she's going to bring to us is that of effectively what happens on the ground. If you're an entity, a company that is balancing the need for maintaining the sustainability long-term of your business and its viability against the need to do the transition, and how does one bring those two things together? And Hermine, of course, is the head of sustainability engagement for Anglo American, where she's worked for the past 15 years in various sustainability roles, and good experience across human rights strategy, ESG reporting, and the like, and currently very involved with engagement with civil society, human rights, and two special projects looking at gender-based violence. Interesting, Hermine, we're in Women's Month. I had to say that, of course, and acknowledge it. And then, of course, the just energy transition. And of course, as recently as 2019, she's led the launch of Anglo American's Living with Dignity program, and a comprehensive suite of initiatives to tackle sexual and gender-based violence in mines and mining communities. So perhaps a slightly different element of justice there as well. Hermine was also co-author of Anglo American's Sustainable Mining Plan, which is now in its 5th year of implementation. Hermine, absolute pleasure to have you here today, and I hand over to you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. there were a few implications there, Shamila, that we have answers, and I'm afraid we've done some thinking, and I'm not entirely sure that there are too many answers, but I suspect we're not alone in that regard. And hello to everyone else who has joined this afternoon. It's a huge group of people. It's a bit intimidating, I must confess. So what I'm going to do is just give you a sense of how we see this transition journey. I'll talk a little bit about the financing side, although I must confess that's not really my forte. And then some of the practical issues that we face on the ground. And that's where we don't have the answers. I'd love to hear if anyone else might. On the just transition. So in my mind, at least, I find it helpful to really think about it as a transition and how you get from point A, maybe not where we are right now, because it's not like we're just starting it, but where we've come from, maybe in the last 5 or 10 years, and where it is that we want to be in the future. And for us, there are a few considerations attached to that. One of them is our portfolio, what we mine now, and what we have mined in the last 5 or 10 years, and what and where we mine in the future. And how the second one being our footprint, our carbon footprint, or obviously how we move that from what it is now to being carbon neutral in the future. And then the third bucket is how that affects people. And for us, people, it means a number of people. It means communities, which is often the focus of the just energy transition. It means employees, but it also means investors and what that dynamic imposes as well. A lot of that conversation is about this absolutely needs to happen, and we get significant pressure. And the next question is, how much is it going to cost, and how are we going to pay for this? So for all of these three, the questions really are, how do we transition quickly? How do we do it sustainably? How do we do it fairly? And like I just said, who will pay for it and how and when? So what have we done? On the portfolio side, we have moved away from thermal coal. And as you know, for steel-making coal, there aren't yet alternative options, but we're looking into technology on that front and currently have a portfolio of minerals that supports the just energy transition. On the footprint side, we've made significant moves to renewables in South America, and will soon in Australia too. In South America, it's 100% renewables. In Australia, we have a target for just a few years' time. And in South Africa, a partnership to bring online between 3 and 5 gigawatts of renewable energy, mostly from solar and wind, but also with investments in the hydrogen economy. On the people side, it's something genuinely we are still thinking through. We do have a future of work stream where we are mapping out the skills that will be required, that are there now and will be required into the future. And we've got a working group with our key unions on that. On the community side, some of the work that we're doing is refocusing existing community development programs. And I caught the word earlier on, the just watching. And that's absolutely something that we don't want to do. It has to be meaningful interventions to not just display existing programs as just energy transition programs, but fundamentally refocus them to fit into a world and contribute to a world where we have fundamentally different economy. So let's go into a little bit on the how to pay for it. One part of it is about refocusing, but the example that was spoken about earlier on is a sustainability-linked loan that we secured with the IFC, or through the IFC, and we announced that just over a year ago. So it's $100 million over a period of 10 years. And we secured it based on 2 social projects. It was the first mining sector loan that the IFC has provided. And it doesn't relate to the just energy transition, but I think the reason that it was raised is because it is a model for how that can be negotiated for JET projects. So what we did was secured the loan on the basis of our education and livelihoods programs in South Africa with specific targets attached to it. So as an example, for schools in our host communities to perform within the top 30% of state schools nationally, and to support 3 off-site jobs for every on-site job at our operations by 2025. So it's not inconceivable to imagine that model being used for just energy transition projects. But that takes me into, I guess, some of the practical considerations that we're grappling with. And the framework discussed earlier on kind of touches on it. I think it was on the pre-screening number 3 on the community voice and capacity development, community voice. And my question around that was how capacity development works in helping support that community voice in decision-making. But mostly it's about the pace of change that is necessary. And it's a lot of whiplash at the moment, the pace of the implementation of renewable energy projects. And that often runs counter to robust stakeholder engagement, which takes a huge amount of time. Another complexity is just who defines just. And there are many efforts around the world to come to a decision on what we mean exactly by just. And I think that there's some really good examples. But at the end of the day, it is communities and local stakeholders who decide what is just. And that might very well change over time. And I think just there are interesting questions then about how we globally have this understanding of what just is. And locally, that might be something quite different. For the most part in our communities, it's simply about having access to electricity at all. There is another, one of the first comments was about what do we mean by community engagement? Is it just community engagement or is it community consent? And for anyone working in the mining industry, you'll be aware that that's where the conversation really is at the moment. When it comes to Indigenous peoples, we talk about free, prior, and informed consent and exactly what that means. And that conversation is translated into an African context too, where it becomes just a little bit more complicated, not that it isn't anywhere else in the world. So I think it would be helpful for us to be quite clear on what constitutes meaningful community engagement and on what basis one agrees what just even is on that level and what we mean by consent. I think I've covered what I wanted to, so I'm going to leave it there because I have seen many questions and I'm sure that Shamila and everyone would like to get through to that.
Thank you. Very sobering view on reality and practical implementation challenges when you're directly involved with communities, what that means, and just the questions even around that. So I've been very grateful for your intervention. Thank you. I want to turn now very quickly, noting we've got about 15 minutes left, some of the questions that have been raised. So I've tried to jot them down and allocate them as I could to our speakers. Sandy, let me start with you. Obviously, a few of the early on questions directed at you. I'm going to look at 2 in particular. The first one, and are there any lessons from the greenwashing practices being unpacked internationally for your framework? And the second one, I'm going to give you both, and then you can hopefully help us with those. Do the project examples include Just Transition Plus projects? And is it possible to drill a bit further into the incentives offered to Just Transition projects? So there might be a little bit of a overlap there with Neil, who might be able to help you. But let me start with those and hand that to you, please, Sandy, if you can.
Thank you very much. Okay, I also noted down the greenwashing question. A lot of lessons that we can learn from and that we absolutely must learn from, because in our existing sample that we used, we have come across several just transition washing investments that have been dressed up that weren't actually just transition. And what we found is that a lot of trying to understand the mechanics of the washing. We found that people were claiming just transition objectives without having activities that would back up the achievement of those objectives. And it's one of the reasons why we insisted on putting down in the framework specific activities, because we thought it's really easy to claim an objective, but unless you tell us what you're going to do to achieve that objective and we can test that, it's very easy to wash. So I think washing is a real challenge, and we are learning from what happened in greenwashing, but we don't have greenwashing sorted yet either. So it's an experience for all of us. I think the point on Just Transition Plus, yes, we do have a project. And also, if I can just put that together with, there were quite a few questions saying, can you give us examples? And I'm sorry, I meant to give examples, but I was worried about time. So let me give you an example of a Just Transition Plus project, which entered through a green gate. It's a mining house who decided to transfer mining land from a closed down mine to the local community, for that land to be rehabilitated and for the land to be used to grow orchard crops. So that was the green portion of the project. It was sustainable agriculture. In terms of the socio-economic improvement, the project included training for orchard management for community members, and also diversifying the economy by bringing in an agro-processor, commercially viable investment to process the orchard fruits. And the plus category was meaningful empowerment through the transfer of the land. So we have got an example of a Just Transition Plus project. In terms of the incentives, concrete examples of incentives, no, because there is still a lot of work being done to finance these transactions. They are being negotiated. What I can say is that offers and terms and conditions have been put on the table to facilitate the financing of these kinds of projects, but the terms and conditions are not quite sweet enough to close the project and the project deal yet. And one is working on sweetening the pot, but certainly credit enhancements have been offered, concessionality has been offered. In some instances, there's been some philanthropic grant money offered, and we just need to kind of get over the line with some of them. Thank you.
Hey, Sandy, while we have you there, because there was a follow-on question, I think, on your mining project. So is the mining project a grant or finance or both? And who will take the risk of repayment of the loan, if and when applicable, commercial success of the commercial component? So yeah, that's a bit of a detailed question. I guess it's more relating to the commercials around that. But I think the core is that is it grant funding or finance, at commercial terms?
It's a combination of all of them. There's some impact investing in there. There's a grant component in there. There is some highly concessionary money in there. There is a credit enhancement, first loss enhancement in there, and there is a purely commercial component. And I think we're getting slightly away from the framework, but what is important to know is that the financing solutions for these kinds of projects is highly complex and multifaceted. And it's going to take being able to pull 5 or 6 different kinds of financing together for a single project to actually make it off or over the hurdle line and to start producing.
Thank you, Sandy. Now, noting that we've got quite a few questions for Neil as well. Neil, let me turn to you, and I might come back to you, Sandy, because there are some other ones coming in thick and fast. And thank you to our audience for making this so interactive. We appreciate your engagement. So Neil, a little bit from your side, is this project part of JET IP and the groundwork for a framework, or is it independent? And how does this all tie back into funding, and who is funding what? So I think that in variations of this question in relation to the JET IP, that how that relates into this, the frameworks have come through on the chat, but let's deal with that first, if you could, please, Neil.
Thank you very much. I'm also pleased that there are so many people on the call that worked very closely with us on drafting the JET investment plan, especially Penny Herbst that posed the question, and Penny was in the PCFTT. So thanks for the question, Penny, and I'll get to your question last. So I mean, the framework provides important inputs into especially the implementation plan and the development of the implementation plan. When we've been speaking in maybe not that politically correct term of setting up a type of a clearinghouse, we will get to the terminology where we are able to, I suppose, do a bit of what your institution did before you joined the NBI, Shamila, and that is that there's people with money and people with something to invest in, and how do you bring those two together in a way that obviously takes all these issues into consideration, but to do so in a way where there is a matching of fit for purpose financing, in a way that is mutually beneficial, where there's mutual accountability, and where you also have a sustainability that is upheld. On just a quick point on the greenwashing, and maybe Sandy wants to come back in on this issue. And I do think that we need to consider the distinction between the demand and supply side. So clearly on the supply side, a bit more careful evaluation of the project. So what if we turn that project around, Sandy, and say, what if a project like that was demanded by a community? I mean, would the requirements, the criteria that is applied, take into consideration that on the demand side there would be a lower bar that is set in terms of the criteria, as opposed to the type of supply side in investments and projects. On the question that Penny asked about the off-balance sheet. So, I mean, clearly we're going to be looking at different mechanisms across the globe, and also some of the work that's being done in Kenya by a group like Africa 50, and also the work that is being done in Brazil, and in particular when it comes to investments in the transmission grid. So we're not going to claim that we're going to be coming up with entirely new options to finance and get around the Eskom ban on borrowing, and in looking at especially investments in the transmission grid, whether it is a concession or an IPT or a joint venture, or maybe even an option where there's a partial listing of either assets or a listing to raise finance. But these things are all going to have to be placed on the table, including sovereign guarantees and the Treasury providing an exemption to Eskom for borrowing, especially in relation to the IPG funding. But I mean, the thing that excites me the most is that we will find a solution. We will come up with a mechanism. It may It may look a lot like the way the Brazilians have financed their grid, or it may be something that is entirely new, but at the same time takes on board the necessary benefits that are being looked for, and also the risk that the different parties would require to be addressed in the way that the financing package is put together. Thanks.
Thank you, Neil. Glad to hear you using the word you feel excited, because I think that's just going to help a whole lot of people who just don't feel excited right now about anything much. So thank you for that. Always good to have some hope. Neil, I'm going to stay with you for a second. There's a question from Leanne, which is slightly related, but could we have more information on how this framework fits into the work of the PCC, and which institution holds the implementation of work to be undertaken under the framework? So it'd be very useful if one of the panelists could reflect on various pieces of existing work around monitoring and evaluation related to the how the JET IP fits together. Includes the work being done by the JET Secretariat, and then monitoring piece as well, monitoring and tracking. Could you help us with that, please?
Yeah. Thanks. Great question. So the PCC are the first to say that they're an advisory body. That's one. The second is that they have a lifespan beyond the PMU, in that their plan is to put in place a framework that is going to take us to over the next 27 years to net zero. They're not responsible for implementation. Their advice obviously feeds into both the presidency, into DFFE and other stakeholders, but it also is an important feed in to the work of the PMU. So as we're developing the implementation plan, the PCC is seen by the PMU as a statutory body that has been mandated to provide advice on a very wide range of issues, whether it is decommissioning, on the just transition components, on challenges within municipalities in delivering on the just transition, and it's perfectly placed to provide the kind of platform on which the PMU is also able to engage with its various stakeholders. So at times, I mean, it may appear that the lines are blurred, that mandates are sort of overstepped, and there's some duplication. But in our almost weekly engagements that we have with the PCC, I mean, we're quite clear in terms of our different roles. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. I think that's quite a helpful clarification, and a question, well not posed, but probably on a lot of people's minds. I just want to pause for a second. We do have, I think somebody, is it hand raised here? Nonwe, please, could you help me with this? I think it might be Louise, who says that she has a hand up, but she can't find the way to show it on the functionality in Zoom. So Louise, can I give you the floor, please? Hi, good to see you again.
Hi, Shamila, and thank you for indulging my hand. Hi, Neil. So I'm not asking questions. I want to make some contributions. I'm Louise Naudin. I'm from WWF South Africa, and I'm a commissioner on the PCC. So what the PCC is still in a process. It doesn't have a recommendation yet, but it is considering different kinds of methodologies for making this judgment call about whether an initiative deserves to be called a just transition initiative or not. And one of the ideas on our table is the idea of some kind of tagging and scoring methodology. And I just want to say personally, it's not a PCC position at all, but having now also heard about the TIPS framework, I'm really liking this flow chart kind of methodology rather than a scoring methodology, because ultimately the decision, that you want to get out at the end is yes, it qualifies, or no, it doesn't. So one doesn't have to score it, and scoring is quite hard, and as subjective as anything else, even though it's a number. How you get to that numbers can be very subjective. So I am liking this proposal. But then I want to talk about one thing that is not about the methodology for how the decision is made, but is about control of this decision. And I think if you want to make sure that a project is serving justice ends, you have to put the people at whom we are trying to direct the justice in the decision-making seat. So I don't know if it's some kind of decision-making body as to what qualifies to get the money or not. You know, it should be staffed largely by members of organized labor and poor organizations of poor communities. Thanks.
Thank you, Louise. Oh, sorry, I'm having an issue here. So I think in the interest of time, and thank you for those who stayed on with us, we've gone 2 minutes over. Louise, inputs very well noted. Thank you very much. I'm going to do a quick 30-second wrap up. Firstly, to thank everybody who's joined us. It has been posted on the chat as to where you can access the framework. So please do that. Please make comments and send those through. Huge amount of work has gone into the first iteration. Judging by just the chat already, I think we can see that there's a lot of interest. Sandy, hopefully a lot of support, which seems to be obvious. I think what has been laid out really gives us hope about the opportunity to create something that is relevant for us locally, that can really help us achieve the dimensions of just that we would like to do. And of course, huge opportunity for more input. So thank you very much to TIPS for today. Very much appreciative of this opportunity. To all of our speakers who have been fabulous. Appreciate that. Thank you so much for being with us today. Neil and Hamin, I'm very grateful for your inputs today, and we're looking forward to receiving all the comments on the framework. Thank you.
Thank you.